Guthrie vanished from her home right here, up that driveway, Tucson, Arizona. I can't believe I've been covering this now for 89 days, since February 1st, pretty much. And you guys have seen me interview a lot of FBI profilers, retired FBI profilers, people whose entire job was to look at a case and try to figure out who the offender is. And one way that they do that is they have this database of information that they collect by interviewing criminals, by going into prisons and interviewing some of the most dangerous criminals that exist, whether it be rapists or murderers or kidnappers, abductors, you name it, they will go in and interview these people. And what's so important about that is they'll spend days, sometimes weeks, sometimes months talking to people, putting all of that information into a database. And then what they can do is when they come out and they look into a case like the Nancy Guthrie case that is unsolved, they can go back and look at all that information that they've collected on past cases and try to determine a profile of who is responsible, which is what we are told is happening behind the scenes likely right now with the Nancy Guthrie case. So I was really interested in this process and what it is actually like to go into a maximum security prison and try to essentially pick the brain of a really, really dangerous, awful human being.
I think the task force, the investigators are just following up on leads at this point, anything that's going to be viable, but any new hot tips? No, I haven't heard anything.
Yeah, one of my sources close to the investigation said there really just is nothing new.
You're right.
Which is, I mean, does that surprise you?
It does, but it doesn't. Based on kind of how this went and kind of how I think people feel what happened to Nancy probably early on, I think that the folks who did this quickly pivoted. Probably, unfortunately, she's probably deceased, probably passed away at this point. And once that happened, I think it changed their plans. And, you know, calling them good bad guys, they just went silent on it and started focusing on something else. And I think that's where we are right now.
What will it take to break it open?
Someone either finding Nancy or, you know, one of the suspects talking to someone and that person probably passing that information on, whether it be to a loved one, someone who has a conscience. It's one of those things. You know, the physical evidence, it still takes time. DNA takes time. All of those things take time. So there's still some hope for that. But truly, it'll probably be one of those two things. Suspects saying something to the wrong person, that making its way back to the task force, or someone finding Nancy's body.
Someone close to the department was telling me there's something called the RAT team. Have you heard of that?
Our robbery assault team. Yeah. That's what we call our robbery assault folks who investigate the violent crimes in the sheriff's department.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And I heard that perhaps they should have been the ones to investigate initially, that they're faster than homicide sometimes. Is there any truth to that?
No, and I know that people have talked about this, and I don't even know if it's been talked about officially, but our homicide unit handles our missing person cases. They always have in the past. So to think this would have been a robbery assault case early on, no, I wouldn't have expected that from any of them.
You wouldn't have expected them to be called in?
No, now they might have. I'm sure that there were robbery assault team folks there helping out, just because of the manpower they had thrown at the case. But the primary investigators, once they determined it wasn't, you know, a missing person or a walk away where search and rescue would have handled it, then it's always going to go. A missing person cases in the sheriff's department always goes to the homicide unit.
Since I last talked to you, I've been interviewing like all these retired FBI profilers. You know, there's like this behavioral analysis unit where they try to figure out who a suspect is. And I'm kind of curious what you think about some of their theories, since you're local. You know, you have an idea of the actual area.
Yeah.
Most of them have seemed to agree that they think it's someone just statistically who knew Nancy, not necessarily like a family member or a friend, but someone who had some kind of contact with her, whether it be like a contractor or just anybody, but not a total stranger. What do you think about that?
They're the experts at that, and I would not disagree with that, especially if multiple profilers have pushed that out. I've always thought it was someone who was focused on her for whatever reason, whether it was they knew her, knew of Savannah, one of those things, but that wouldn't surprise me at all.
Do you think, and this is another thing they brought up, that it could not even be a ransom, that could have all just been sort of a cover-up?
I think so.
Do you think that?
I do, because when you talk about a single Bitcoin, a half of a Bitcoin. That's not normal for someone who's they're gonna ask for $10 million. That's kind of just how I think that would work. And I think that something happened early on with Nancy, and that was a part of their pivot. Let's throw that out there to try and get these folks off our scent, our trail, or whatever it might be, and just move on from there.
What's the latest with the sheriff situation? Because I know the Board of Commissioners basically demanded he answer these questions. He responded and answered. What happens next there?
So it's my understanding that he had 10 days to respond to the answers under oath. It's my understanding that his responses were not a sworn statement. They were not under oath. So in my opinion, he kind of flipped his nose at the Board of Supervisors. So now they will go on to the process of the next step is they will have to vote amongst themselves if they want to attempt to remove him from office. And I don't know the ins and outs of the statute that they're working under, but that would be a decision by the board members that would say, there's a lot that has gone into this. There's a lot of things that, in my opinion, the sheriff has done wrong, and factually, he has absolutely failed as a leader. He's lied under oath. He has shown through independent investigators that he expects his commanders to violate the code of ethics like he did. That is fact. That's not my opinion. He used his position in government for political gain. Again, not my opinion. That's fact. That was found out. So these are the things that the Board of Supervisors has to take into consideration. And did all of that affect the case with Nancy? I'm sure it did, because that trickle-down effect, hearing those things, it's okay to violate the code of ethics. It's okay to use my position to push people down. Heather Lappin and Aaron Cross and a few others who were pushed into positions that really neutered them for the rest of their careers. That affects everyone within the department. So I hope that the Board of Supervisors has the professional courage to do what's right. If you have a man who lied under oath in a deposition to keep his multiple suspensions back in El Paso out, he didn't misspeak on that. Brian, if I asked you, how many times have you been suspended from your job? What's that answer?
Thankfully, never.
Me neither.
Yeah.
That's not a question you have to think about.
Yeah.
That's a question you know the answer to just like that. And I challenge anyone to ask a friend, a neighbor, a coworker, how many times have you been suspended? The answer is usually 0. If the answer is 8 and you say never, that's a flat out lie. That was in a lawsuit. There's no way to come back from that. He should be on a Brady list through our county attorney's office.
What does that mean?
That is a list that the county attorneys put together. Typically, it's for lying. Officers get on it, and it kind of neuters them in their positions, because every time it's you can't be trusted list. And there have been officers on it in the past, and every time you have to testify, hey, is it true you're on the Brady list? Yes. So it just destroys your credibility. With him, with the sheriff at this point, he has no professional credibility left, in my opinion. That's my opinion. Going back to the Board of Supervisors, they do need to do what's right, because if they say, we're just going to let this slide, they have now said to every member and every employee within Pima County and every citizen within Pima County, it's okay to lie to us. It's okay to violate the code of ethics. There are no consequences. It's okay to not only ask your senior commanders to also do that, but expect them to do it. And that's why the leadership, this is not my opinion, is in a very bad position within the Sheriff's Department. And that affects the troops. That affects the people who are investigating this case. It's been like that for quite a while. I think we within the Sheriff's Department knew it, and that's why several of us stood up for a change at the last election. We saw what happened there. And now the nation, the world now knows what we've been dealing with. And going back a roundabout way to that Board of Supervisors question, they have to do what's right. It's not even about politics at this point. You can't let that man stay in power. If you do, you have justified everything he's done, to include factually lying under oath, violating the code of ethics, using his position to influence the last election. So I'm passionate about that. I know that the county can do better, that the sheriff's department can do better, and I know that the sheriff's department can be saved at some point, because it was an awesome agency for my first 22, 23 years. We loved it. I know you've talked to Aaron Cross, and he feels the same way. That's why he's as passionate about it. And he's the lone voice left in the agency because, really what more can they do to him? And he's going to continue that battle.
But can the Board of Supervisors really, because the sheriff is elected, is there anything, and I think it was like if he didn't respond to the questions, there was something they could do, right? But now that he's responded, is there, but he can't just throw him out, can
they can, because he was required to respond in a sworn statement and under oath. And again, it's my understanding that he did neither of those, so that would be a violation of the statute that they're working under. So if he violated that...
And a willingness to sit with uncertainty while patterns slowly emerged from the noise. Brian Entin had covered enough crime stories to recognize when something felt off from the beginning. But now, deep into the investigation, that initial sense of wrongness had transformed into something more specific. Not just a feeling that pieces didn't fit, but a growing understanding of why they didn't fit. Because the more experts like Dr. Gary Brucato examined the evidence, the more it became clear that this case didn't follow the single perpetrator model that so many people instinctively assumed. The inconsistencies that had troubled investigators from the start, the blend of careful planning and unexplained errors, the moments of control followed by apparent carelessness, these weren't signs of randomness. They were signs of something else entirely. Multiple decision makers. When you look at crimes committed by individuals acting alone, there's usually a consistency to the behavior. One person's thought process, one set of priorities, one way of responding to unexpected challenges. The actions might not always make sense to outside observers, but they follow an internal logic, because they're coming from a single source. But when more than one person is involved, that consistency breaks down. Different people bring different behaviors, different reactions, different levels of control. One person might remain calm under pressure. Another might become careless. One might stay focused on the ultimate goal. Another might hesitate or second-guess decisions in the moment. And when those differences overlap during the execution of a crime, the result can look inconsistent or even chaotic. But underneath that surface disorder, there's still a pattern. You just have to know where to look for it. That's where the concept of hierarchy becomes critically important. Not everyone involved in a crime holds the same level of responsibility or exercises the same degree of control. Some people follow instruction, others provide them, and the ones who lead, the ones making strategic decisions, rather than tactical ones, they often stay completely out of sight. They don't take unnecessary risks. They don't put themselves in positions where they can be easily identified or connected to the crime through physical evidence. They operate from a distance, which makes them significantly harder to find. But that doesn't make them impossible to identify, because even when they don't appear directly in the evidence, their influence does. It shows up in the planning, in the structure of how events unfold, in the priorities that shape each decision along the way. And if you examine those elements closely enough, you can start to see where that invisible influence exists. Brian began to consider seriously whether that was what had been missing from the investigation so far. Not the person who physically carried out the crime, but the person who set everything in motion. Because if this really was a layered situation involving multiple participants with different roles, then focusing exclusively on the visible suspect might lead to some answers, but not the complete story. And without the complete story, critical questions would remain unanswered. Important connections would stay hidden. The true scope of what happened and why it happened would never fully come into focus. That possibility stayed with him because it fundamentally shifted the investigative approach. It meant looking beneath the surface actions to understand what was driving them from behind the scenes. The deeper this analysis went, the clearer it became that this case wasn't just about one night. It was about everything that led up to that night. Every quiet decision made in advance. Every unnoticed connection that seemed insignificant at the time but wasn't. Every moment where someone crossed an internal line that brought them one step closer to committing an act they might never have imagined themselves capable of before. And somewhere within all of that accumulated history was the truth, the premise that would make everything else make sense. One of the aspects of this case that continued to trouble investigators was the choice of victim. Why Nancy Guthrie? On the surface, it sounds like a straightforward question, but the more you examine it, the less straightforward it becomes. Because when you look at it through the lens of purely financial motivation, which had been one of the early theories, it doesn't line up neatly. If someone was looking for money through criminal means, there were easier targets, safer approaches, situations that wouldn't bring this level of immediate attention and sustained investigative pressure. Nancy's circumstances made everything more complicated. Her family's visibility, the resources available to them, the spotlight that immediately fell on her disappearance the moment it became public. Anyone planning something like this would have to understand those factors going in. They would have to recognize the enormous risk they were taking, and yet they still chose her specifically. That doesn't happen by accident or pure opportunity. It happens when there's a reason that outweighs all those risks. And that reason doesn't always announce itself immediately. Sometimes the explanation is buried in something small, a prior interaction that seemed routine at the time, a moment that didn't register as significant to anyone involved, a connection that existed but went unnoticed because it appeared so ordinary. Those are precisely the kinds of details that don't stand out until you know exactly where to look. And right now, that's where the investigative focus had shifted. Not outward toward strangers and random possibilities, but inward toward the network of people who had crossed paths with Nancy at some point in her life. Not necessarily the obvious ones, not just family members or close friends, but anyone who had access to her home or her routine, anyone who had seen her environment firsthand, anyone who had enough exposure over time to understand her patterns and vulnerabilities. Because familiarity doesn't require closeness in the emotional sense. It can develop through observation, through time spent in proximity, through small interactions that accumulate over weeks or months, or even years. And once someone develops that kind of familiarity, it fundamentally changes how they move through a space. It changes how they think about opportunities. It gives them confidence. And that confidence was exactly what stood out so strikingly in the surveillance footage. The suspect moved like someone who already understood the environment. Not someone discovering it for the first time, but someone who had processed it previously and retained that knowledge. There was another layer to this that hadn't been fully explored in the early stages of the investigation. The possibility that the crime might not have started as what it appeared to be on the surface. When people examine cases like this, they naturally tend to focus on the final visible act, the break-in, the abduction, the disappearance. But those are just the endpoints, the culmination of something that began much earlier. What matters equally, if not more, is everything that happened before any of that became visible. The planning stages, the conversations between participants, if multiple people were involved, the moment when the idea first took shape in someone's mind. And if there were indeed multiple people involved, those early moments become even more important to understand, because group dynamics change everything. Adding more people doesn't just add more hands to carry out a plan. It adds more perspectives, more influences, more internal pressures, and often more instability. One person in a group might hesitate while another pushes forward aggressively. One might clearly see the risks while another minimizes or ignores them entirely. And when those conflicting perspectives collide during the planning or execution of a crime, the plan can shift in ways that no single participant fully controls. That's often how things go wrong. Not because the foundational plan was weak or poorly thought out, but because the people attempting to execute it weren't perfectly aligned in their thinking, their priorities, or their responses to unexpected complications. Brian kept returning to that framework because it explained something that had been bothering him from the beginning. The inconsistency visible in certain details, not massive contradictions in the overall approach. But small moments that didn't quite match the level of control and planning demonstrated elsewhere. Actions that felt slightly off, not completely wrong or irrational, but just enough to raise questions. Those kinds of small inconsistencies frequently point toward one specific thing: multiple decision makers operating within the same event, not necessarily equal in authority or influence, but present and active. And if that assessment was accurate here, it meant the crime wasn't simply the result of one person's thought process. It was the result of a process, a sequence of choices made by more than one individual, each bringing their own priorities and limitations to the situation. That makes crimes harder to trace in some ways, because you're not following a single clear line of logic, but it doesn't make them impossible to solve, because even in group situations, there's almost always someone at the center, someone who holds the primary vision for what's supposed to happen, someone who sets the overall direction, even if others are involved in execution. And that central person tends to leave a different kind of imprint on a crime. Not in obvious physical ways necessarily, but in the structure, in how the plan unfolds, in the priorities that shape each significant decision. When Brian examined the case through that specific lens, something started to shift in his understanding. The man visible on camera didn't look like that central organizing person. He looked capable, physically comfortable with what he was doing, but not precise in the way you would expect from someone who had planned every detail themselves, down to the smallest contingency. There were subtle signs suggesting he wasn't the one thinking 10 steps ahead. He was thinking in the immediate moment, executing instructions or following a plan, not designing one from scratch. And that distinction mattered enormously, because it meant the real answers to the deepest questions might not be found primarily in what he did, but in why he was doing it, who positioned him there, who gave him the reason or the instructions, who stood to benefit from Nancy's disappearance. That realization turned the focus once again toward the unseen elements of the case. The person or people who never appeared on any camera, the ones who didn't leave footprints in the obvious places that investigators search first, because those invisible participants are often the ones who shape the outcome most significantly. But they're also the hardest to identify precisely because they don't stand out. They blend into normal life. They look unremarkable, sometimes even trustworthy. That's what makes them effective in criminal contexts and dangerous. Even with that shift in investigative focus, there were still elements of the case that refused to settle into place comfortably. One of the most significant was the behavior after the crime itself, because no matter how carefully something is planned in advance, the aftermath is almost always where things start to crack. People react to the stress and fear of what they've done. They slip up. They change in visible ways. And those changes can be subtle at first. A difference in normal routine that someone close to them might notice. A shift in behavior that feels slightly out of character. Something that creates a sense of things being off, even if the observer can't immediately identify what's wrong. And in cases where multiple people are involved, those cracks tend to appear faster and more obviously, because the pressure of maintaining silence and normalcy isn't distributed equally. Some people carry that weight better than others. Some break sooner under the strain. And when they do, it creates opportunities for investigators. That's why in many complex cases, the eventual breakthrough doesn't come solely from physical evidence or forensic analysis. It comes from people, from someone noticing something unusual, from someone recognizing a pattern of changed behavior, from someone connecting a detail that didn't make sense before to new information that suddenly gives it meaning. And that's where the public becomes critically important. Not in a broad, unfocused way where everyone speculates wildly, but in a very specific, targeted way. Because sometimes all it takes is one person having one moment of recognition. The way someone walks, the way they move their body, the way they carry themselves physically. Those are elements of human behavior that don't change easily. You can hide your face behind a mask. You can change your clothing completely, but your fundamental movement patterns, the way your body naturally moves through space, That's much harder to disguise or alter. And for someone who knows you, even somewhat casually, that can be enough. Enough to spark a memory. Enough to create a connection between the person they know and the suspect they've seen in footage. Enough to turn a vague suspicion into something more concrete that's worth reporting to investigators. Brian had heard this theory before from multiple sources. The belief that someone out there had already seen the surveillance footage and recognized something in it. Maybe not consciously or clearly at first. Maybe just a feeling. A nagging sense that something looked familiar but hadn't fully clicked into conscious awareness yet. And if that assessment was accurate, then the answer wasn't just hidden in evidence that hadn't been found. It was hidden in people's minds, in everyday interactions, in those quiet moments where recognition happens but hasn't yet been voiced or acted upon. That's why some investigators believe strongly in releasing more information to the public at strategic points. Not everything. Certainly not details that could compromise the integrity of the case, but enough to trigger that moment of recognition in someone who has the critical piece of information without realizing it yet. Because once that recognition happens, once someone makes that connection, things can change very quickly. But that approach carries its own significant risks that have to be carefully weighed. Too much information released publicly can compromise a prosecution. It can lead to an overwhelming flood of false leads that consume investigative resources without producing results. It can create confusion that makes it harder rather than easier to identify the truth. And in a situation like this, where the details are already complex and multi-layered, that risk is very real and has to be taken seriously. So the balance becomes absolutely critical. What information do you share publicly and when? What do you hold back to preserve the integrity of the investigation? What do you risk in order to potentially move forward? Those decisions aren't easy, and the right answer isn't always clear, but they can shape the entire direction and eventual outcome of an investigation in ways that aren't immediately visible when the choices are being made. Brian understood that complexity. He also understood something else that investigators working cold cases have long recognized. Time changes things, not just the case itself, but the people involved in it. The longer something like this goes unresolved, the more internal pressure builds, quietly at first, invisibly, but building nonetheless. And eventually, that accumulated pressure has to go somewhere. It doesn't simply disappear or fade away on its own. It shows up in behavior, in choices people make, in mistakes they wouldn't have made earlier. And when it does surface, that's often when the next major shift in a case happens. Not because someone planned it or because investigators did something differently, but because the people involved couldn't hold the weight of it internally any longer. And when that moment finally comes, the truth has a way of finding its way out into the open, even if it takes considerable time. Time has a way of changing everything in ways both visible and invisible. Not just the direction of a criminal case, but the people inside it and around it. The longer something like this stays unresolved, the more it settles into the background of everyday life. At first, a case like this dominates everything. News coverage runs constantly. Conversations focus on it. Speculation fills social media and community discussions. But then, slowly and inevitably, it starts to fade from that intense public focus. Not completely. People don't forget entirely, but just enough that most people begin to move on with their lives, and attention shifts elsewhere, at least on the surface, because underneath that public quiet, the pressure doesn't disappear at all. If anything, it builds. For investigators, that pressure comes from the professional and personal need to solve something that continues to resist solution, despite their best efforts. For the public, it manifests as lingering discomfort from not knowing what happened, from questions left unanswered. But for the people actually involved in the crime, whoever they are, that pressure becomes something much heavier and far more personal. Because no matter how careful someone believes they've been, no matter how well they think they've covered their tracks and controlled the situation, there's always one critical element they can never fully control themselves, their own behavior, their own reactions, their own internal experience of carrying that weight day after day. Brian had seen this pattern play out in other cases over the years. Situations that seemed completely airtight at the beginning slowly started to develop cracks, not because new physical evidence suddenly appeared, but because of behavioral changes in people connected to the crime. Small shifts in patterns, things that didn't immediately stand out as significant, but over time began to form a recognizable shape. A person who suddenly becomes noticeably more withdrawn from normal social interactions. Someone who changes their daily routine for no clear or obvious reason. A shift in spending patterns that doesn't match their known income. A reaction that feels just slightly too strong or too defensive when the case gets mentioned in conversation. None of these things prove anything in isolation. No single behavioral change constitutes evidence of guilt, but together, accumulated over time, they start to tell a story. And in a case like this, where the visible physical evidence only goes so far in answering the critical questions, those kinds of behavioral patterns can matter more than almost anything else, because people leave traces, not just physical ones that forensic teams can collect and analyze, behavioral ones, psychological ones, and those are often significantly harder to hide over extended periods of time. Brian started thinking more carefully about the people existing on the edges of this case, not the obvious ones, who had already been extensively questioned and cleared through investigation, but the ones who existed just slightly outside the center of focused attention. The ones who move through social and physical spaces without drawing much notice or concern, because those peripheral observers are often the people who see the most. People who observe carefully without themselves being observed. People who pick up on details precisely because they're accustomed to paying attention without being the focus of attention themselves. And in this specific case, that group of peripheral observers might be far more important than anyone had initially realized, because if the suspect truly was local, if he had moved through the area with that notable level of confidence and environmental familiarity, then there was a strong probability he had been seen before. Maybe not clearly, or in circumstances that seemed significant at the time, but enough. Enough for someone to potentially recognize something familiar in the footage. And when that kind of recognition happens, it doesn't always arrive with absolute certainty attached to it. It typically starts as a feeling, a moment of hesitation, a quiet internal thought that something doesn't quite add up, or that someone looks oddly familiar. That's where the process of recognition begins, and if that initial feeling is strong enough, if it persists rather than fading, it leads to action. A tip called in to investigators, a conversation with someone who might know more, a piece of information that might seem small in isolation, but fits into a larger picture in ways the person providing it might not even fully recognize. That's how investigative momentum builds in complex cases. But in this particular case, that momentum hadn't visibly materialized yet. At least not in any way that had become public knowledge. And that absence raised its own important question. Why? Why hadn't someone stepped forward in a way that fundamentally changed the investigation's direction? Because statistically, based on extensive research into similar cases, that's what tends to happen. In crimes involving more than one person, the silence among participants rarely holds forever. Someone talks, someone makes a slip, someone eventually decides that the personal risk of staying quiet has become greater than the risk of speaking up. And when significant reward money is involved, especially a sum as substantial as the one attached to this case, that calculation shifts even more dramatically in favor of someone coming forward. But here, once again, there was that same puzzling silence, which strongly suggested something deeper at work, something that couldn't be explained by financial incentives alone. Fear. That was the concept that kept surfacing repeatedly in analytical discussions of the case. Not fear of being caught by law enforcement, though that's certainly present, but fear of consequences that extend beyond the criminal justice system. Because in situations where there's a hierarchical structure among participants, where one person holds significantly more power or knowledge than others, the internal dynamics change fundamentally. The people lower in that power structure don't just worry about police and prosecution. They worry intensely about the person above them in the hierarchy. The one who planned everything. The one who knows the most. The one who has the most to lose if the truth comes out. That particular kind of internal fear can be powerful enough to keep someone quiet, even when there's $1 million financial incentive sitting directly in front of them. Because money doesn't matter if you don't feel safe enough to claim it. If you believe that coming forward will put you in a different kind of danger that money can't protect you from, and that possibility added yet another complex layer to understanding this case. It suggested that whatever happened that night wasn't just about identifying an opportunity and acting on it impulsively. It was about control, not just control during the commission of the crime itself, but control maintained afterward. Control over information, over participants, over the narrative. And if someone was actively maintaining that control, it meant they were still present in the situation, still aware of developments, still watching. That idea might sound unsettling, or even dramatic, but in cases like this, it's not at all unusual. People who commit serious crimes don't just vanish from their own lives afterward. They return to them. They go back to their routines, to their jobs, to their social circles, to environments where nothing is supposed to appear different on the surface. But internally, everything has fundamentally changed. And that internal change doesn't always stay completely hidden. It shows up in small ways, in reactions that are slightly off, in decisions that don't quite match previous patterns, in moments where the accumulated pressure becomes temporarily too much to contain perfectly. Brian thought carefully about how that kind of internal pressure might be building in whoever was involved, day by day, quietly, without anyone on the outside necessarily noticing at first. Because the longer something like this remains unresolved, the more it lingers as an ongoing presence. It becomes part of the background, something that people stop actively thinking about every single day, but never fully forget. And for the person or people responsible, that kind of lingering, unresolved presence can be extraordinarily difficult to escape, because it's not just an external investigation they're aware of. It's internal. It's the knowledge that something remains unfinished, that something could still come back in unexpected ways. That one moment, one mistake, one person deciding to speak up could change everything instantly. That's the kind of psychological weight that doesn't fade easily over time. And eventually, it starts to affect behavior in observable ways. That's where investigators with experience in long-term cases often shift their focus, not just examining what happened during the crime itself, but looking carefully at what changed afterward in the lives and patterns of people connected to it. Who started acting differently in noticeable ways? Who seemed out of place in contexts where they'd previously been comfortable? Who reacted to mentions of the case in ways that didn't quite match what you'd expect from their supposed relationship to it? Those are the questions that begin to matter more as time passes, because they point towards something that physical evidence alone can't always reveal. They point toward the human dimension of crime, the psychological reality of carrying guilt or fear or knowledge that can't be safely shared. And human behavior, despite our best efforts, is rarely perfect. No matter how careful someone tries to be, no matter how well they believe they've planned for every contingency and controlled every variable, there are always cracks, small imperfections, moments where the mask slips, just slightly. The challenge for investigators is finding those cracks and recognizing them for what they are. And in a case like this, those behavioral cracks might not be obvious or dramatic. They might not stand out immediately as significant, but they're there, existing beneath the surface, waiting to be noticed by someone who knows what patterns to look for, waiting for someone to connect dots that haven't been connected yet. That's why time can work in two very different directions in criminal investigations. It can make a case feel colder, more distant, increasingly harder to solve as memories fade and physical evidence degrades. But it can also do precisely the opposite. It can bring things to the surface slowly and gradually, until what was hidden becomes visible. Not all at once, in a dramatic moment, but incrementally, enough to shift the direction, enough to open new pathways of investigation. And when that shift happens, when that tipping point is reached, it often doesn't take much additional pressure to push things forward significantly. A single new detail, a single connection that hadn't been made before, a single moment of clarity where something that seemed confusing suddenly makes complete sense. That's all it takes sometimes. Brian understood that reality. He also understood that cases like this don't resolve themselves overnight through sudden breakthroughs. They take time. They require patience. They demand a willingness to sit with uncertainty and incomplete information while continuing to work methodically. But they also rely fundamentally on something else. People, because in the end, no matter how complex a case becomes, no matter how many layers it develops, it always comes back to the same basic truth. Someone knows something. They might not fully realize yet that what they know is significant. They might not think it matters in the larger context, but it does. And when that realization happens, when someone recognizes that the small detail they're aware of actually connects to something much larger, that's when everything starts to change. Because once silence breaks, it doesn't go back. It moves forward. It creates momentum. And when it does, the truth follows. By the time a case reaches this particular stage, it stops being purely an investigation in the traditional sense. It becomes something else, a waiting game. Not the passive kind people often imagine where nothing is happening behind the scenes, but a more active, deliberate kind of waiting. The kind where everything is still moving, but slowly, carefully, methodically. Where every decision carries weight, and every piece of information has to be handled with precision. Because at this point, it's no longer primarily about identifying what's missing. It's about properly understanding and connecting what's already there. Whether someone can arrange the existing pieces in exactly the right way to reveal the picture they form together. Brian had experienced this phase before in other cases, but it never felt comfortable or easy. There's a particular tension that settles in during this stage, a sense that the answer is genuinely close, almost within reach, but not quite there yet. Like standing in a dark room where you know something important is present, but you can't see it clearly enough yet to identify it with certainty. You can feel it. You can almost make it out, but not quite enough to act on it definitively. That's where this case had arrived. And in moments like this, the smallest details suddenly start to matter the most. Things that once felt completely insignificant or routine suddenly carry enormous weight. A movement someone made, a phrase they used, a reaction that didn't quite fit the context at the time, but might mean something significant when viewed with additional information or from a different angle. All of it gets pulled back into focus and re-examined. Because when the bigger picture refuses to come together cleanly, when it resists easy interpretation, the truth often hides precisely in those edges, in the details that seemed too small to matter. Brian found himself returning to the same fundamental question again and again, approaching it from different angles. What are we not seeing? Not in the obvious sense of evidence that was overlooked or ignored during initial investigation, but something that existed the entire time, that was present in the available information all along, but hadn't been understood yet, hadn't been placed in the right context that would make its significance clear. That concept, context, kept emerging as central to everything, because without proper context, everything feels scattered and disconnected. Surveillance footage is just footage. Behavior is just behavior. Individual details don't connect into coherent patterns. But once the correct context becomes clear, once you understand the framework within which everything exists, the entire picture shifts dramatically. Suddenly what seemed strange becomes logical. What appeared confusing becomes structured and clear, and the story begins to tell itself. Dr. Brucato had stated it directly and plainly. Once you understand the true premise underlying a crime, everything else will make sense. But finding that premise, identifying it correctly, that's the hardest part of the entire analytical process, because it requires stepping back from assumptions, letting go of initial theories that seemed compelling, but don't quite fit all the evidence. Being willing to consider that the answer might not look the way you expected it to look based on experience with other cases. And in this specific case, that meant confronting something genuinely uncomfortable. The idea that this wasn't primarily about opportunity. It wasn't simply about money, though financial elements might be present. And it wasn't just about a plan that happened to go wrong in execution. It was about intention. Not just intention in the moment of the crime itself, but intention that existed and developed long before that. Because crimes of this nature and complexity don't begin when someone physically steps through a door or makes initial contact with a victim. They begin much earlier, in thought, in decision-making processes, in quiet moments where someone gradually convinces themselves that what they're contemplating is somehow justified or necessary. That's where it genuinely starts. And once that internal process begins, once someone crosses that initial psychological line, it doesn't stop easily. It builds on itself. It evolves. It finds ways to make itself feel increasingly reasonable and inevitable, until the moral and legal line that once seemed absolutely impossible to cross no longer feels like a line at all. It becomes something that can be rationalized, justified, accepted. That's the part of crime that people don't see. The part that doesn't show up on surveillance cameras. The part that leaves no physical evidence that forensic teams can collect and analyze. But it's absolutely there, existing in the internal world of the people involved, and it shapes everything that follows. Every decision made, every action taken, every response to unexpected complications. This case may never fully make sense to the outside world in the way people want it to, not because it can't eventually be solved, but because the reasons behind it might be too specific, too personal, too rooted in circumstances and relationships that only make complete sense to the people directly involved. That happens more frequently than most people realize. The explanation exists. The logic is there, but it doesn't feel emotionally satisfying to observers. It doesn't seem to match the scale of the crime or answer the deeper questions about why someone would do this. It just explains the mechanics of what happened and why those particular people made those particular choices in that particular situation. But even if that's ultimately the case, even if the complete picture never feels fully satisfying on an emotional level, there are still concrete things that can be known, patterns that can be identified and followed, truths that can be uncovered through careful analysis and persistent investigation. And in this case, those truths were already beginning to take recognizable shape. The suspect wasn't random. That much had become increasingly clear through multiple lines of analysis. The level of environmental comfort, the familiarity with the space, the way the entire crime unfolded, it all pointed consistently in the same direction. This was someone who knew more than a random stranger should have known. Someone who understood the environment they were entering. Someone who didn't feel like they were stepping into genuinely unknown territory. And that kind of operational knowledge doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from proximity, from prior exposure, from connection, even if that connection isn't immediately obvious or direct. Brian knew that from experience. He also knew that cases like this don't typically end with a single dramatic moment where everything suddenly becomes clear. They don't resolve in a flash of revelation. They unfold piece by piece, connection by connection, until eventually something fundamental shifts. A critical connection is finally made. A detail falls into its proper place in the larger picture, and what once felt impossible to understand becomes clear, not because it was hidden particularly well, but because it simply took time to see it accurately for what it really was. That's where this case was heading, not toward a sudden dramatic revelation that would resolve everything instantly, but toward a gradual one, a slow accumulation of understanding that would eventually reach a tipping point. And when that moment finally comes, when all the pieces finally align properly, it won't feel like a surprise. It will feel inevitable, like something that was always there, existing in plain sight, waiting patiently to be seen and understood correctly. Until that moment arrives, the story remains open, unfinished, carrying with it the weight of everything that hasn't been answered yet, but also carrying something else. A quiet certainty that answers do exist, that they're somewhere within reach, somewhere in the connections between people, in the patterns of behavior, in the details that haven't been properly understood yet, waiting for the right moment, waiting for the right person to make the right connection, waiting for the silence to finally break. And when it does, when that silence finally breaks and the truth begins to emerge, everything will change. If this case has raised questions for you about how we understand crime, about who we trust, about the invisible connections that shape our lives in ways we rarely consider, then this channel needs your support. Hit that like button. Subscribe to Revealing Untold Crimes, because there are more stories like this, more cases that challenge everything we think we know, more truths waiting to be uncovered. And we're just getting started.